in a not-so-spacious hotel room. As soon as he said that, Lumiere began to regret it. He was just unreasonable, not ignorant of the world. Hence, he hurriedly explained. No, that's not what I meant. I just don't know how to express myself in the common language. Don't misunderstand. As he spoke, he even spoke a few words in the native language. In short, Matthew is not my partner. Madam, you can rest assured. Lumiere emphasized to Bobo. In his opinion, the two of them must have a deep relationship if they stay in the same room at night. Bobo's eyes lit up when he heard that. You can tell that I'm a lady. Seeing that the topic had changed, Lumiere immediately chuckled and said, That's obvious. Bobo puffed out her chest proudly and looked at Matthew. Look, it's not my problem that someone's eyesight is bad. There are still many people in this world who can distinguish the truth. Matthew smiled bitterly. His perception was actually quite sharp, but it was naturally incomparable to a Tier 5 big shot like Lumiere. He exchanged a few more pleasantries with Lumiere. As he spoke, Lumiere had an idea. He expressed that he had traveled for a day and was hungry. He hoped that the two of them could get him something to eat. Matthew saw that it was dark and Lumiere probably wouldn't be able to find another place to stay for a while, so he looked at Bobo with a questioning gaze. Bobo's impression of Lumiere had greatly changed because he could accurately identify her feminine characteristics. She nodded coolly at Matthew. The next moment, Matthew smiled and led Lumiere into his private room. After the two of them entered, they did not come out for a long time. Only Bobo, who had been woken up in the middle of the night and had lost her sleepiness, was left. Bored, she could only wipe her armor again. The next morning, Matthew calmly walked into a magic supply store in the North Trade District. He wanted to replenish some supplies for the trip to the Dalangyan Lake, and the most important one was the underwater breathing potion. After the user drank this potion, 2 pairs of cheeks would form on the skin on both sides of the neck, thus gaining the ability to breathe freely underwater. Underwater breathing potion was a potion that was widely used. Although the production habits and processes were different in different places, the effects were often similar. Matthew wasn't worried about not being able to buy good potions, but he was worried that the price would be too expensive. The funds he had on hand were far from enough to squander at will. However, when Matthew walked around the shop called Desert Light, he almost couldn't suppress the excitement and joy in his heart. He came to the counter and asked calmly, How much is the underwater breathing potion? The shop owner was a hobgoblin wearing pince-nez glasses and knitting a sweater. She was much taller than ordinary goblins, but she was still only about 2/3 the size of a human. When she heard Matthew's question, she immediately put down the woolen rack and gently introduced 12 gold coins per stack. The price is marked clearly. Her common language was very standard. Other than her appearance, she did not seem to be any different from a human female. Matthew pretended to ask casually, 12 gold coins. Why is it at this price? The female goblin slowly replied. Is the customer finding it expensive? This was already the result of a discount. Underwater breathing potions had always had a stable market, not to mention that they were made by the deep-sea Naga, and their quality was trustworthy. To tell you the truth, this potion was originally going to increase in price. Previously, the Nagas had always felt that they were selling it too cheaply, but as soon as they raised the idea of increasing the price, internal strife broke out among themselves. It was said that it was due to a great bard. The magic craftsmen of the Naga tribe were also divided into several factions. There was no way to raise the price. And in order to seize the market, our shop even lowered some prices yesterday. If you want to buy more, I can give you a discount. The discount is not much. It's just to express our gratitude for your support of the Eternal Night tribe. Matthew took a bottle of underwater breathing potion from the shelf and found that the label of Eternal Tribe was indeed pasted on its back. At this moment, his heart was suddenly enlightened. No wonder they're selling so cheaply. It turns out that foreign products have flooded into the market. The original monopoly of mages and a small number of alchemists has been destroyed. Not only are the Naga products cheap and effective, but the local mages probably won't be able to compete with their prices anymore. Also, why do I hear news of Lorraine everywhere I go? Matthew found it funny. He calculated in his mind for a while, and then, with a wave of his hand, he bought 20 sets of underwater breathing potions and 10 sets of the more powerful frogman potion, which cost 18 gold coins. In this way, he only had around 100 gold coins left. However, Matthew did not panic at all. They only needed to transport this batch of potions to a big city near Rolling Stone Town, Bayan City, Jade Court, Jilu City. LT could be sold anywhere for more than 8 times the price. This profit margin was over the top. Matthew wished he could build a teleportation gate in Condor City and travel back and forth every day. However, this was obviously unrealistic. The cost of ultra-long-distance teleportation could easily wipe out the profits of running a business. The idea of running a business seemed to only exist in fantasy. Wait, it's not entirely impossible. I can find a safe spot in the wilderness and build a shrine for the goddess of moonlight. Matthew pondered over a feasible plan. In his opinion, the Moonlight Woodlands was actually a very promising route for long-distance cargo transportation. It was a pity that the southernmost part of the area covered by Asai's divine power had not reached Marsh City yet. A high-level blessed creature like Ella could return to the Moonlight Woodlands under the moonlight from any location in the prime material plane, but that didn't mean that she could return at will. Without a shrine or altar as an anchor point, returning to the Moonlight Woodlands under the moonlight was destined to be a one-way ticket. Matthew seriously considered the feasibility of building a shrine in Condor City. The geographical location of Condor City was actually very advantageous. It was the central section of the north shore of the Gold Coast. Whether it was on the sea or on land, the flow of people was very large. At the same time, it was located in the middle of the four terrains. To the north were the mountains. The mountains were Mount El Goksing and the Millennium Mountain Range. The latter was a natural barrier that stretched for nearly 1,000 miles, dividing the vast land in the south into two parts. The Millennium Mountains were a dangerous place that many high-level adventurers hated. In addition to the terrifying and dangerous terrain, the mountains were also unevenly distributed with the habitat of eagle men, air elementals, mountain giants, green-footed dragon snakes, salamander men, specters, and red-robed monsters. It was said that there were also traces of liches and twilight creatures. In short, it was very dangerous. To the south was the sea, and the sea was the Arana Sea. The port of Condor City was very large, and it was very suitable for doing business with the Naga, the overlord of the deep sea. To the east was the rainforest, the Django world. To the west was the endless poplar desert, where there were many oases. These oases fed 99% of the desert population. The merchants of Condor City were willing to go to the oases to do business, but later, someone claimed that there was an adult blue dragon living in the poplar desert who liked to rob people. Gradually, the trade route that traversed the desert and connected to the oasis became deserted. There was no need to mention the main road that ran from east to west along the coastline. The geographical superiority of Condor City was obvious. When Ella comes back from her long break in the Moonlight Woodlands, I'll ask her about the method of building an altar. Matthew secretly made up his mind. His thoughts were set. While the hobgoblin lady boss was packing the goods, Matthew casually asked, "Are you knitting sweaters for your family?" However, the weather in Condor City was so hot. Who would wear a sweater here? The other party smiled and replied, "My son, Quint, is the vanguard of the Black Dragon Lord in the extreme Frost City in the north. I haven't seen him for many years. This year, I received a letter from him saying that he has a child. My husband and I plan to save some money so that we can visit them. I knitted this sweater for my grandson, whom I haven't met yet. For this reason, I specially learned some exquisite skills from the Sioux people next door." Matthew took the packaged box. After confirming that there was no mistake, he said goodbye to the lady boss and left. It could be seen that the hobgoblins had lived in human society for a long time and had basically been assimilated. They also cherished the things that humans cherished, and the customs of humans gradually became their customs. When dealing with them, one could indeed ignore their race to a certain extent. They left the shop. Lumi and Ree followed at once. Lumiere had been thinking of an excuse since last night. Now, his thoughts were finally clear. He decided to stay by Matthew's side first. After gaining his trust, he would think of a way to lure him back to the rainforest without disturbing him. So he said to Matthew, "Ever since I advanced, my path of legend has been opened. My instincts told me that it was outside the rainforest, so I left the rainforest. It's just that I'm too unfamiliar with the outside world. Coincidentally, your scent left a deep impression on me, so I unknowingly came over to find you. I actually didn't know what to do next. I was full of curiosity and fear towards the outside world. Perhaps this was the adaptation period for me. Matthew, if it's possible, can I stay by your side during this time? Don't worry, I won't freeload. I'm very capable. I'll do anything you want." Matthew looked regretful after hearing this. "So that's how it is. Lumiere, I'm happy to help you. Unfortunately, I'm afraid I won't be able to travel with you for the time being." Lumiere asked in shock, "Why?" Matthew said regretfully, because I'm about to enter the rainforest, and your legendary path is outside the rainforest. I'm afraid we'll have to go our separate ways. He then walked towards the hotel. Lumiere was left alone, dumbfounded. Back in the guest room, Matthew smelled a burning smell. He looked down and saw Shorty sitting on the floor, playing with a brick meticulously. Where did you get the brick? Matthew asked curiously. It's best not to distract an arcane machinist when they are injecting the item so as to avoid creating an explosion tragedy. Bobo didn't even raise her head, and her tone was icy cold. After a while, Matthew saw that the brick began to emit red light crazily. His eyelids twitched, and he was about to retreat. Fortunately, the red light disappeared in an instant, but there was an additional irritable smell inside the brick. Hint, your machinist partner Bobo has successfully created a brick bomb. Matthew's expression changed. Are you making a bomb? Bobo snorted softly. What do you think? I can't possibly go out on an adventure with a bomb on my back. That would be too insecure. How can an arcane machinist go out so perfunctorily? Matthew said in a deep voice, you promised me that you wouldn't blow up the tomb. Bobo looked at him in confusion. Yes. But what about the outer area and the blind monsters inside the tomb? Can't I use bombs? Matthew rubbed his temples. He suddenly understood Lion's headache yesterday. It's not that bombs can't be used, but there aren't that many occasions where they can be used. As if he was coaxing a child, he said gently. My summons and spells are enough to deal with most situations. Moreover, we have strong reinforcements. Although the man you saw yesterday's behavior was a little strange, he's actually not bad and is very strong. Just take this brick with you. There's no need to make more. Upon hearing this, Bobo's expression did not change. However, two antennae suddenly stood on both sides of her helmet, and the top of the antennae flickered with a faint red light. What is the meaning of this? Matthew stared at the antenna. It means I'm very happy. Bobo replied coldly. Immediately, her voice was a little shy. If you can promise me one thing, I can turn the red light that symbolizes happiness into an even happier yellow light. Matthew asked, what is it? Can I touch you? Bobo raised her head and widened her eyes, which were filled with desire. She pointed at Matthew's right hand and said, it's this glove. I can feel the wondrous power it gives off. It has a terrifying power that can destroy everything, but it also makes me excited. Let me touch it, and I won't argue with you. Matthew realized that the negative energy emitted by the hand of paleness had corroded part of the glove. In the eyes of the arcane machinists, anything could be injected. Item injection was their most basic professional ability. Each item would produce a different reaction after being injected. Of course, the most common reaction would be an explosion. If Bobo had wanted an ordinary item, it would have been fine, but this glove was a first-class dangerous item. Matthew shook his head and refused. Sorry, this glove concerns my privacy. I can't give it to you. Bobo's little face immediately fell, and the red light on the antenna became even more dazzling. Seeing this, Matthew quickly took out a biscuit from his bag and handed it over. Why don't you try this? Bobo looked at Biscuit with disdain, but she still took it. She placed the biscuit in her palm. After a slight arcane wave, the biscuit emitted a blue light. Hint, your machinist partner Bobo has injected the biscuit. Bobo has successfully created a magic biscuit. After consumption, instantly recovers 20% of mana. The mana standard is taken from the average value of a Tier 3 mage cookie that instantly recovered mana. Matthew was stunned. Bobo placed the biscuit in her palm and asked Matthew expressionlessly, do you want it? Matthew nodded. Catcha. She quickly stuffed the biscuit into her mouth and chewed it in large mouthfuls. She even provoked him vaguely, and it's gone. Matthew was stunned at first, but then he smiled helplessly. Hint, you have seen through Bobo's cantrip, crossing the heavens. You have discovered that Bobo has hidden the real magic biscuit in her palm. Matthew didn't ask for the biscuit. He admitted that although Bobo's way of thinking was unique, she wasn't someone who couldn't be communicated with. If there were a situation that needed the biscuit, she would definitely be willing to take it out. The two of them prepared for a while. Lumiere arrived late. He looked for Matthew with a conflicted expression. Matthew, I think I might have remembered wrongly. My legend path seems to be in the rainforest. Matthew, who had long noticed Lumiere's various abnormalities, went straight to the point. Did the soul of the rainforest send you to find me? Lumiere was shocked, but he soon said with relief. You guessed it yourself, so you can't blame me, right? It was indeed a mission given by the soul of the rainforest. I couldn't understand it either. Then, he described the mission he received from the flying squirrel in detail. Matthew smiled after listening. It's okay. Just stay by my side. No matter what the soul of the rainforest was planning. Now that Matthew was about to go to the dangerous Dalong Lake to rob a tomb, to seek an opportunity to advance, how could he not accept a Tier 5 blow darter who had delivered himself to his doorstep? After lunch, the three of them left Condor City and headed towards the rainforest. When they left Condor City, they also encountered a few ruffians with unfriendly expressions. Unfortunately, before they could even get close, they were sent flying by Bobo's lightning gloves. At that time, many people had seen this scene. Therefore, the rest of the journey became very comfortable. Nothing happened until they entered the rainforest. After entering the rainforest, it was even safer. Lumiere was a true child of the rainforest, and Matthew Sua's joy had not expired yet. The two of them walked forward hand in hand. This gave Bobo the illusion that this rainforest was quite safe. A day and a half later, the group arrived at the Dalong Lake. However, before he could get close, Lumiere said solemnly, "There's the sound of fighting." The three of them walked forward quietly. Not long after, they discovered two groups of people fighting by the Dalong Lake. There were 40 to 50 of them, and they were all of high levels. They didn't look like good people. It's the Sandstorm Bandits and the Order of Calamity. Among the three of them, Bobo was the one with the most information. She excitedly took out the big bomb from her backpack. "What do you think? Shall we break up the fight?" Matthew shook his head. He brought the two of them around the main battlefield where the two sides were fighting and approached the Dalong Lake from another angle. Then, he took out 3 frogman potions and signaled for them to enter the water. Lumiere and Matthew had both taken the potion. Very soon, gills grew out of their necks, and their leg strength was greatly enhanced. In the water, they only needed to kick lightly, and they would be able to jump far away. Only Bobo refused to take the medicine. She hopped to the shore and jumped. With a bang, she sank into the water like an iron lump. Matthew and Lumiere quickly followed. After entering the water, the two of them got used to it for a while before they realized that they had lost track of Bobo. A moment later, a strong current suddenly rushed out from the bottom of the water. Matthew focused his eyes. A layer of glass had appeared on Bobo's helmet. Her pair of heavy steel boots were currently puffing backwards. She hooked her finger at Matthew and dove down. The two quickly followed. However, the gap between the two sides was widening. The swimming speed provided by the frogman potion was already amazing. However, Bobo was like a high-speed torpedo in the water. In the end, probably because she felt that the two of them were swimming too slowly, Bobo floated up from the bottom of the water again. Then, she grabbed the clothes around the necks of the two men and suddenly sank down. A few minutes later, they arrived at the bottom of the Dalong Lake. From afar, Matthew saw a huge statue. The bottom of the statue was covered by a large amount of white sand, and the top was covered with water grass. The statue held a sword in its left hand and a talisman in its right hand. Its facial features matched the image of the Sioux. Hint, you have discovered the bright Sandalwood King's underwater statue. Knowledge, Giant/Sioux Clan plus 10. Beauty plus 10. This is the place. There's no mistake. Matthew walked around the statue 3 times and successfully found a secret door at the base. He took out the defensive psalm and activated the spell recorded on it to crack the secret door. It was beyond his expectations. The secret door was instantly unlocked. The three of them looked at each other, and Matthew was the first to walk in. After passing through the secret door, the wet feeling and the heavy water pressure instantly disappeared. In front of Matthew was a huge underground square. There was a stone tablet in the center of the square that was filled with dense tadpole characters. Behind the stone tablet were a dozen smaller stones that were engraved with carvings. Matthew walked over and subconsciously placed his hand on the stone tablet. A surge of information rushed into his mind. Hint, you have received the inheritance of the art of equilibrium. Do you wish to continue? The inheritance had already been activated, so how could it be interrupted? Matthew chose to continue. More information flooded into his mind. He stood in front of the stone tablet with his eyes closed and beads of sweat on his forehead. Black and white images flashed before Matthew's eyes. Within a few breaths, not only did he successfully receive the inheritance of the Equilibrium Envoy, but he also learned part of the story of the first Equilibrium Envoy of the Sioux Clan, Bright Sandalwood King. Matthew slowly opened his eyes. The tadpole-like characters on the steel twisted quickly and evaporated in a short while. It was the same for the dozen or so pictures behind the stone tablet. Matthew turned around and asked bitterly. After you came in, did you see anything on the stone stels and stones? Bobo shook her head silently. Lumiere looked at the stone tablet curiously. Isn't this always blank? Matthew nodded in his heart. This proved that his guess about the stone tablet was correct. Only those who had the potential to become the envoy of equilibrium would see the tadpole characters and those patterns. This required at least two conditions. First, and most importantly, the mark of the Sioux. Secondly, the person who came into contact with the stone tablet had to have at least two legendary paths or two particularly powerful powers. This should be a necessary condition to activate the inheritance of the envoy of equilibrium. As long as he passed this threshold, it would be very easy to accept the inheritance. For example, Matthew did not understand the content of the tadpole language at all, but he could still easily understand the information that was poured into his mind. It was probably because the person who left behind the inheritance had considered that the birth of the envoy of equilibrium was not easy. Therefore, they made it more convenient. Matthew, who had gone all the way to the south, finally got what he wanted. But there was still confusion in his eyes. Prompt: you have received the inheritance of the special profession, Envoy of Equilibrium. You can choose between the following two ways to add the ability of the Equilibrium Envoy to your ability list. Advance: unlock special path, balance of all things. Side profession: faced with XP penalty. According to Matthew's previous thoughts, there was a high chance that he would directly choose to advance. After all, the Envoy of Equilibrium had a special path, which meant that his future achievements were limitless. However, after taking stock of the information he had inherited, Matthew hesitated. He did not make a rash decision. Instead, he closed his eyes and began to recall the origin of the Envoy of Equilibrium. And if he wanted to sort out all of this, he had to start from the start. According to the information stored in the stone tablet, he was the first envoy of equilibrium in this world. In that unknown era. After a terrifying disaster swept across the eastern continent, the bright sandalwood king, who had long had a premonition, led the people on 12 ships with the ability to travel far away. They left their homeland and headed west in search of a safe shelter. In the process of crossing the endless ocean, bright sandalwood king's fleet encountered two great difficulties. The first difficulty occurred in the southeast of Endless Ocean. There was a trench at the bottom of the sea that led straight to the abyss. A sea monster that could destroy the world lived in the trench. Legend had it that it was also a member of the Twilight creatures. When the bright sandalwood king's fleet passed by the top of the trench, they were ambushed by the sea monster. The latter swallowed the ship at the front in one gulp. The sea monster was extremely huge, almost as wide as the land, and its body was so long that one could not see the end. At that moment, everyone on the ship was shocked. Only bright sandalwood king stepped forward. He left the ship alone and flew to the belly of the sea monster with a flying spell, asking for a negotiation. The sea monster admired bright sandalwood king's courage and expressed that it was willing to give him a chance. However, the sea monster also said that the location of the negotiation could not be at sea but at the bottom of the sea. Thus, bright sandalwood king followed the sea monster to the bottom of the sea. The negotiation lasted for about 72 hours. At that time, the sea was covered with dark clouds and stormy winds. The scene was very scary. A few captains with weak wills secretly drove the ship away. When the negotiations between the bright sandalwood king and the sea monster ended, and he returned to the surface of the sea, he discovered that there were only 5 ships left waiting for him. He did not get angry. He only sighed and said, "Those who stayed could still survive, but how could those who left quietly survive?" As expected. When everyone cheered and welcomed bright sandalwood king back onto the ship, the fleet successfully sailed through the rainy sea area. They quickly saw the wreckage left behind by the ships that had escaped in advance. Bright sandalwood king told the others. The people on these ships were also eaten by the sea monsters like the first ship. Fortunately, he had already negotiated with the sea monster and the other party would not make things difficult for the rest of the people. The rest of the crew cheered. There were also people who were curious as to what the bright sandalwood king and the sea monster had discussed and what method the bright sandalwood king had used to dispel the sea monster's thoughts of devouring them. Unfortunately, the bright sandalwood king was tight-lipped about this topic. Until his death, no one knew the contents of the negotiation. After that, the fleet headed west. A few months later, they arrived at the west side of the Endless Ocean. According to their calculations, it was less than 3 days' journey from there to the Barbarian Tooth Peninsula, which belonged to the Ander continent. Here, the bright sandalwood king fleet encountered a second extremely troublesome problem. A plague broke out on the ship. This plague was very strange, and everyone had different symptoms. The bright sandalwood king discovered that the stronger the Sioux clansmen, the more serious the plague would be. Especially the high-level professionals led by the Taoist priest, each one was sicker than the other. The herbs and spells they had mastered were useless against it. The Sioux began to die in large numbers. Even though Bright Sandalwood King tried his best to solve the problem, he was unable to do anything. Not long after, he also fell ill. Fortunately, there were still some healthy people on the ship. They continued sailing under Bright Sandalwood King's orders and finally arrived at Barbarian Tooth Peninsula after a period of time. The fleet of the Sioux had docked here for nearly half a year. The people who died from the plague eventually accounted for 2/3 of the population on the ship, especially the Taoist priests. This was also the fundamental reason why this special profession gradually lost its inheritance. During this period, the Sioux began to frequently contact the local Aborigines in order to save themselves, and both sides began a large amount of trade. Not long after, the seriously ill Bright Sandalwood King sent people to learn some voodoo techniques from the native shamans. Under the strong suggestion of the shaman, the Bright Sandalwood King made a desperate attempt and fed the remaining patients, including himself, a powerful hex poison. As a result, something magical happened. After the hex poison entered the body, the symptoms of the plague were greatly reduced. Although it was not completely eradicated, at least it could save people's lives. At that time, Bright Sandalwood King was very emotional. If they had arrived at the peninsula earlier, perhaps even more people would have been saved. Unfortunately, fate had already been cast, and no one could change it. The Bright Sandalwood King, who had barely managed to survive, began to study the plague in his body. He was a true genius. When he was in the Sioux country, he was once the leader of the Great Wall Mages. He was rewarded for his meritorious service in resisting the demons. When he arrived at the Barbarian Tooth Peninsula, his class level was a level 16 Great Wall Mage and a level 4 Taoist. He was a half-step legendary mage. Very quickly, his research had some preliminary results. Bright Sandalwood King's research showed that the plague itself was only a fuse. A large number of Sioux clansmen on the ship died because of the differences in the laws and domains of existence between the East and West continents. Why did so many Taoist priests die? This was because most of these Taoist priests in the Sioux country had mastered the power of 2 domains at the same time. Controlling wind, rain, lightning, and summoning zombies and ghosts were actually from the same domain in the eastern continent. However, the concepts and mastery of these powers on the western continent had long been divided by the gods. If they were to encroach on different territories, they would inevitably incur the backlash of the laws. In comparison, the plague was only a symptom amplifier. What killed a large number of Sioux people was actually their own power. The voodoo poison given by the native shaman happened to have the effect of weakening strength, so it could greatly alleviate the symptoms. This discovery made the Bright Sandalwood King extremely depressed. He admitted that the gods didn't even take the initiative to attack. This was the natural reaction of the domains that had been deeply imprinted by them. This meant that the western continent was not an ideal place for the eastern people to take refuge. However, they had no other choice. It was difficult to return to their homeland, so they could only choose to adapt. The information about the inheritance after that was a little vague. Matthew only knew that after the Bright Sandalwood King left the Barbarian Tooth Peninsula, he spent a long time researching the situation of the western continent's domains. In the end, he used a divine artifact he brought from the eastern continent as the foundation and created a balanced domain out of thin air. He used this to reconcile the opposing powers of several attributes in his body. He had succeeded and stepped into the legendary realm. However, he had also failed because even the Bright Sandalwood King himself had to rely on that divine artifact to maintain a long-term equilibrium. For generations of envoys of equilibrium, if they wanted to advance further in this profession, they had to sign a contract with that divine artifact. In the information that Matthew had obtained, there were also annotations of the envoy of equilibrium on that divine artifact. From their attitude towards the divine artifact, it was not difficult to see that this thing was not reliable at all. For example, the second-generation messenger of equilibrium, who was also the 4th son of Bright Sandalwood King, left behind a note like this: "Heavenly artifacts are unpredictable, and the heavenly Tao is unfathomable." These words were tactful. When it came to the 7th generation of the envoy of equilibrium, the style gradually began to deviate. The legendary path of the envoy of equilibrium consists of capturing artifact spirits. One could never tell where a spirit is hiding. You would remember the contract you signed with the divine artifacts always, and you'd want to slap yourself. When the last envoy of equilibrium was about to die out, he left a note. "Stupid artifact spirit, it only knows how to neglect its duties every day. It can't fulfill its original promise at all." The art of equilibrium was wrong from the very beginning. Everything is biased, so how can there be equilibrium? Unless it is the harmony of the two most primordial powers. But how could a mortal do this? It's too difficult. All envoys of equilibrium should die. From this, it could be seen that the envoy of equilibrium profession was filled with uncertainty. It was a brand new profession that the bright sandalwood king had created to save himself. However, the situation was different for Matthew because he already had half a foot in the equilibrium domain. The king and the others are quite pitiful. From the time they arrived at the barbarian Tooth Peninsula, the ascension of the heavenly palace had not happened yet. The domain's concept would subconsciously try to please the gods. This was the reason why the plague occurred. If they had come after the ascension of the heavenly palace, things might have been different. The gods would have been exiled by the calamity mage, the power of domains within them would not have taken the initiative to oppose the Sioux. According to the description in the inheritance, the profession of Taoist priest is mainly to control wind, rain, lightning, and summon zombies and ghosts. This is equivalent to the combination of evocation mages and necromancers. In this era, these two domains do not conflict. Could it be that before the ascension of the heavenly palace, the gods at that time had infinitely divided the domains to the extent where they would conflict? Matthew sighed softly, feeling somewhat incredulous. To him, there was too much useful information hidden in this inheritance. This information might even be more valuable than the class of equilibrium envoy. However, it also left him with many doubts. How did Bright Sandalwood King negotiate with the sea monster that was created by Twilight? Was the content of the negotiation related to the strange ritual of the Sioux walking into the sea before they died? Were the Taoist priests really killed in large numbers because of the conflict of domain power? And what was the divine artifact that Bright Sandalwood King used to establish the equilibrium domain? Where was it now? These were all things that Matthew was very interested in. However, he was also very clear that not every question in this world could be answered. Many mysteries were destined to disappear in the fog of history. If he were too persistent, he would easily kill himself. Most importantly, he had to make a choice now. My path is already very clear. Nature and undying, this is a path that cannot be changed. I don't need an overly powerful advancement. What I need more is stability. Most of the random factors in the advancement process must be eliminated. I need the power of balance to balance the two paths. Even my system name has been messed up by undying and nature. When they grow stronger, it's hard to guarantee that the two domains won't fight in my body. Therefore, I need this power, but at the same time, there's no need to pay too much for the class of envoy of equilibrium. After figuring out what he needed, Matthew's thoughts were extremely clear. Hint, you have chosen side profession. You have consumed a large amount of XP. You have obtained envoy of equilibrium level 1 second profession. Warning, when upgrading your second profession, envoy of equilibrium, you will face the penalty of having a side profession. You will need to consume an additional 50% of your XP to advance. You have obtained the class characteristic of envoy of equilibrium, supreme harmony. Supreme harmony, you can harmonize the various powers in your body together so that they are in a balanced and stable state without conflict. At the same time, you have also obtained the ability to harmonize spells. Harmonize spell, through a spell action, cannot be omitted. You can choose 2 spells or abilities that belong to different domains from the list of abilities you have mastered to harmonize. After the harmony is completed, you can upgrade one of the spells or abilities to an enhanced spell ability. The spell or ability will have a stronger effect when released. The other spell or ability that had been tempered would automatically enter cooldown. Note 1, different spells will have different strengthening effects after being harmonized. Note 2, you can now use harmonize twice a day. After obtaining the supreme harmony, Matthew could clearly feel that the power in his body had become more balanced. Above the Teiji symbol, the art of equilibrium, which was originally a dotted line, became a solid line. Matthew could see many green and gray spots of light pouring into the balance from nature and undying, eventually mixing into dark green spots of light. However, the dark green dots of light did not stay in the equilibrium for long. They quickly dispersed into the domains of nature and undying. Soon, the dark green light spots that entered the life and undying domain split into gray and green again, and they expelled each other back to their own territories. This repeated. Although the number of light spots in the 3 paths varied, it also formed a dynamic balance. The hidden danger that had been buried in his heart had finally been alleviated. This made Matthew extremely happy. What he was more interested in was the ability to harmonize spells. It could actually harmonize abilities from different domains, allowing one of them to exert greater power. The key was that different combinations could produce different strengthening effects. This was very interesting. Matthew couldn't help but use one on the spot. This ability required a standard spell action and lasted for about 5 seconds. After the blending was completed. Of the two abilities Matthew had chosen, one was available, and the other was on cooldown. Hint, you have used the spell Harmony. The target of the Harmony is Wild Form, Raven and Rotten Sack Mastery. After the reconciliation, the Wild Form, Raven was strengthened to the Wild Form, Corrupted Raven. The size of the Raven you have transformed into is expected to increase slightly. Perception and Agility +1, and it has a powerful infection ability of the Sack of Decay. This is fun. If it weren't for the limited number of times, Matthew would probably play with it every day. The most interesting thing about this ability was that as his strength increased, he would obtain more and more abilities, and the results of the combination would also increase exponentially. If not for Lumiere and Bobo watching from the side. He wished he could transform into a raven and fly around. It took a lot of effort for Matthew to calm down. In addition to the class characteristics, the level 1 Equilibrium Envoy also brought him a new ability. Equalized Perception. No matter where you go, you will be able to sense the local energy field. If there is any imbalance, you will immediately detect it. You can use this ability to conduct elemental tracking or use it as a basis to rearrange and repair the energy field. This was also a very useful support ability. Only elemental creatures could sense energy fields. It was mainly made up of the 4 elements and spiritual attributes. The loss of some kind of energy usually represented an abnormality in the energy field. Some powerful monsters would also change the local energy field when they passed by, so it was very suitable for tracking enemies. As for rearranging the energy field, Matthew did not have the ability to do so yet, but if he encountered a tinkering job in the future, he could really give it a try. The continuous expansion of the Scar of the Dead might be related to the imbalance of the energy field. Matthew's brain worked very quickly and immediately found a use for this ability. Moreover, it was a very useful use. At this point, the level 1 Envoy of Equilibrium gave Matthew a passive class characteristic and 2 useful or interesting abilities. And he had only paid a portion of his XP. A level 1 Envoy of Equilibrium is enough for me now. Next, I should proceed with the advancement of the Knight of the Undead. If the Envoy of Equilibrium could show a certain degree of stability in the future and prove that this path is more promising, it is not impossible to develop the secondary class into a main class. Matthew thought to himself. Of course, doing so was not without cost. It would cost a lot of XP. However, what Matthew did not lack the most was XP. I'm done. Let's go. After finishing his job, Matthew turned around without hesitation. He didn't even glance at the tomb passage that vaguely appeared in the depths of the square. Bobo said in astonishment, "Are you done just like that? This is too fast." Matthew was speechless. "Don't tell me you like to be slow." Bobo hesitated, "But aren't you here to advance? This is too easy." "Is it easy?" Matthew smiled. "You just happened to see the satisfaction when I harvested the fruit, but you never saw the hardships when I went through the wind and rain." Matthew was not exaggerating. In order to obtain the inheritance of the Envoy of Equilibrium, he had indeed paid a lot. Just because of some legends, he had crossed more than half of the southern land, from the pestilence-ridden swamp city to the rainforest that was full of difficulties. If it were an ordinary person, he would have died on the way. Even if he obtained news of the art of equilibrium, he might still suffer a huge loss in the rainforest. As long as Yulian pointed him to a dead end, or if he did not run into Bobo's matter and did not leave a good impression on Yulian, the latter might even charge him a large sum of money or ask Matthew to do something of equal value. These experiences added together had actually far exceeded the effort required to advance normally. Although he only got a secondary profession in the end, Matthew didn't think it was not worth it. Life was like this. After working hard, he would be satisfied with the results, no matter how big or small the results were. I mean, are we leaving just like that? Aren't you going inside to take a look? Bobo reluctantly turned her head to look at the entrance of the tomb. Matthew's voice came from the front. I told you I'm not a grave robber. As he spoke, he walked out of the secret door. But, I haven't blown up anything yet. Bobo was still turning her head back with every step she took. A large hand suddenly reached out from the secret door and forcefully dragged her out. The stubborn machinist could only compromise in the end. The path from the bottom of the lake was also extremely smooth. They did not encounter any monsters along the way and returned to the shore. Our luck is really good. Lumiere was jumping habitually on the shore minus This was the after effect of the frogman potion. His jumping ability was amazing, and he could jump 4 to 5 meters high. We didn't even bump into a single monster. How strange. Usually, there are so many plesiosaurs in the Dalong Lake. But soon, Lumiere, who was jumping in the air, changed his expression. Hurry up and leave. Matthew noticed that he was looking in the direction where the Order of Calamity and the Sandstorm Bandits had been fighting. Is someone coming? The Order of Calamity or the Bandits? Matthew asked cautiously. No, there are monsters over there. Oh my god, run. There are corpses everywhere. The Order of Calamity and the Bandits were mostly wiped out by the monster in the lake. Lumiere could not help but shout. At this moment, there were already a few monsters surrounding the shore from that direction. Matthew grabbed Bobo's hand without a word and ran away. Lumiere hurried after them. The group fled into the rainforest. After a while, a few plesiosaurs walked over. They looked at the dense rainforest and couldn't help but let out a few low howls. They wanted to step forward, but they held back because they were afraid of something. They gradually retreated and finally disappeared by the lake. A day later, at the edge of the bitter water swamp, the three figures slowly appeared. What do you think happened to those two groups of people yesterday? Could it be that you secretly issued a bounty mission to both parties to search Dalong Lake to lure the monsters away from us? Matthew smiled and replied, a real necromancer might do that. Bobo corrected, and you are a true necromancer. Matthew glanced at her. Actually, you didn't have to follow me all the way here. After leaving the tomb, the favor you owe me has already been offset. Bobo said seriously. The favor owed by the machinists cannot be repaid so easily. Yesterday's grave robbing operation went too smoothly. I must help you blow up something today. Matthew shrugged and stopped persuading her. Instead, Bobo looked at the reeds in front of her and asked curiously, so what are we doing here? Find a few zombies to spend the night with. Matthew said casually. His eyes searched the edge of the swamp and soon found his target. They were two zombies trapped in the reeds and mud. There was even a shiny nameplate hanging around their necks. Found them. Matthew turned around happily. In the end, he met Bobo's disdainful gaze. You can even sleep with zombies. Necromancers are really unexpectedly disgusting. Matthew didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He was about to explain that it was a misunderstanding. At this moment, Lumiere, who had been watching from the side, suddenly said, there's a fight up ahead. Haha, I love watching people fight. Let me see which fools are acting so presumptuously in my territory. Hee hee, one of the idiots belongs to the bandit gang from yesterday. The other group of idiots, seems a little familiar, fuck. That's my tribe. Noticing that his clansmen were being beaten, Lumiere immediately pounced forward like a mad dog. At this moment, only then did Matthew realize how terrifying this guy's physical body was. Lumiere dashed into the forest at the speed of a bullet and swiped at the nearest bandit. Puff. The latter's neck was instantly torn apart, and a large amount of blood spurted out, spraying the bushes beside him everywhere. No. 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 The bandit's eyes were wide open as he clutched his neck and staggered to the ground. Lumiere ignored him and pounced on the others with a low growl. Lumiere was completely different from his usual self when he was in combat mode. It was as if the polite, embarrassed, and smiling boy had disappeared the moment he smelled blood. What replaced it was a real killing machine. He was like a nimble cheetah but also like a violent tiger. He pounced, bit, scratched, and slapped. No one in the bandit gang could withstand a single move from him. 20 seconds later, the ground was covered in blood. The 20-man bandit gang was wiped out. Lumiere raised his head from a corpse, his lower face covered in blood. The sight of it sent shivers down the spines of the other Jangos, let alone Matthew. This guy might really become the king of the rainforest or even an even more amazing figure. In addition to his shock, Matthew also admired him. For a moment, he saw Suya's shadow in Lumiere. That wild and violent killing stance was definitely not an act. It was Lumiere's desire for blood from the bottom of his heart, as well as his hunting instinct that had been trained hard. What was even rarer was that even though he had the potential to become the king of the rainforest, he had always maintained an approachable attitude and was full of curiosity about the outside world. This was rare in conservative indigenous tribes. After the battle, Lumiere was already negotiating with his clansmen. Matthew did not go over. He did not want to trouble Lumiere. Hence, he shifted his gaze away and happened to see Bobo taking out the bomb from her backpack. He hurriedly pressed down on Bobo's helmet. What are you doing? Matthew noticed that his actions had directly caused the antennae on both sides of the helmet to stand up, and a faint red light lit up above them. "I'm helping to mediate the fight," Bobo retorted righteously. "We can't just beat up one side, right? That's so unfair." Matthew realized that she probably did not understand the word clan, so he quickly explained the relationship between Lumiere and the Jangos. Only then did Bobo put the bomb back in resentfully. She unhappily adjusted the straps of her backpack. "Is that so? If I had known, I would have thrown a small brick earlier." "Sigh, why are the two of you so fast?" Matthew patted her head gently. "The next time you want to use a bomb, can you discuss it with me in advance? I'm a timid person and I'm afraid of sudden sounds." Bobo rolled her eyes at him impatiently. Blah blah blah. However, the light bulbs on the antennae on both sides suddenly turned from red to blue. After a while, Matthew heard her whisper, "Got it, coward." A moment later, the Jangos retreated and Lumiere returned to explain the situation. That group of people just now called themselves the Wind Bandits. They seem to have some connections with one of the two groups by the lake, but they are not the same. My tribe members discovered them accidentally entering the rainforest during their daily hunt. At that time, they seemed to be searching for something, and both sides started fighting at the slightest disagreement. Fortunately, I arrived in time because the bandits had the advantage in numbers. My tribe members might not be able to defeat them." Matthew nodded. Bobo suddenly interrupted. "It was the Wind Bandits that died in your hands, and the Sand Bandits and the Order of Calamity that died by the lake. The Wind and Sand Bandits were originally in cahoots, but they've been backstabbing each other due to the recent civil strife." Lumiere revealed a look of surprise. "This is very unusual. Actually, I don't care about their internal strife. I only care about whether they will appear in the rainforest. This place was very dangerous for them. If there were not enough benefits, these people would not take the risk." He looked at Matthew apologetically. "I'm afraid I have to go back to the tribe first to see the situation. There are so many outsiders in the rainforest, and I feel that something is not right." Matthew agreed. "Your analysis is correct. You don't have to worry about us." Lumiere was also very decisive. After bidding farewell to the two of them, he disappeared into the depths of the forest in a few flashes. Matthew looked around. Like Lumiere, he had sensed the abnormality of the jungle. If he had been distracted by the discovery of the envoy of equilibrium before, then now, Matthew realized that the degree of abnormality this time was probably beyond his expectations. This was because he had not seen any flying squirrels since he entered the rainforest. It was impossible for Lumiere to replace the flying squirrel as Suya's spy. He was not a blessed of the soul of the rainforest. All the signs showed that Suya was not in the mood to pay attention to Matthew at all. Then what was Suya doing? Things weren't that simple. Therefore, Matthew tried to communicate with the Black Banyan Dream. With the recognition he received, as long as he was in the rainforest, he should be able to enter the Black Banyan Dream easily. However, this time, he was rejected. Hint: due to unknown interference, you are temporarily unable to enter the Black Banyan Dream world. Matthew's heart sank. If Suya were playing hard to get, it would be fine. However, if something happened in the rainforest recently that required her to close the Black Banyan Dream realm, then it would be dangerous. Matthew did not have a particularly good impression of Suya. However, she was a proper nature soul, and her attitude towards him was not bad. He was happy to see Suya control this rainforest. However, if someone else wanted to replace her, Matthew had to consider whether to interfere. However, it was not yet certain that something had happened to the rainforest. When Lumiere returns, he should be able to find out the truth. Matthew calmed down and turned his attention to Miss Zombie in the reeds. Ever since he became an envoy of equilibrium, he found that he could easily distinguish the gender of the undead by observation. For example, Soldier was indeed a man when he was alive. For example, the two zombies in front of him were both female. It was not that their remaining secondary sexual characteristics betrayed them, but that Matthew could accurately sense the proportion of fat on their bodies and a series of other details. After a few casual glances, Matthew found an empty space to sit down and waited silently for the sky to turn dark. Bobo also followed him eagerly. She came to Matthew's side and took out 2 folding stools from her backpack like a magician. She sat on one and signaled Matthew to sit on the other. Matthew was very touched. He sat on it and felt a warmth on his butt. "Oh, it even has a heating function. It would be so blissful in winter," he praised as he stretched. Bobo chuckled, the light bulb above her head emitting a yellow light. Matthew reminded her. In a while, I'm going to perform a ritual called the Night of the Undead. It will be my springboard to advance to a high-level necromancer. There might be many unfamiliar undead coming over. Bobo immediately shook her head like a rattled drum. I haven't seen a necromancer advance yet. Although it's disgusting to imagine it, I'll have to see for myself how disgusting it is. Matthew didn't mind. He just smiled faintly. Actually, it's not that disgusting. Speaking of which, why did you leave the Cyber Dragon? Bobo said happily. Finally, someone asked me this question. The reason why I left Cyber Dragon was to find a book called Machinery, Fire Dragon and Titan. It was a very great work, a masterpiece left behind by a legendary machinist. It was said that as long as one could find it, they would be able to open up a unique path different from a normal arcane machinist. In Cyber Dragon, I was just an insignificant craftsman. My invention was laughable in the eyes of other machinists and not worth mentioning. Every time the chief gives me a job, it's always the most leisurely and simple. Furthermore, the Cyber Dragon has very strict control over the machinists. We even have to control the share of bombs they make every year. I really can't stand it. Later, I heard that as long as I could find Machinery, Fire Dragon and Titan, I could make bombs on Cyber Dragon without limit, so I sneaked into the sewers and left. I wanted to look for the book directly, but I found that I had no clue at all. Fortunately, before I became a machinist, I was a member of the Huo Sisters. The purpose of this organization was to help women in dire straits resolve all their difficulties and live their lives. In fact, I was able to enter the Cyber Dragon and become a machinist because of the recommendation of the Huo Sisters. Therefore, after leaving the Cyber Dragon, I also wanted to find them and ask for their help. Sisterhood had already moved away. Moreover, they didn't leave any hints behind. I could only try to find them based on some scattered clues. In the end, I met Lily in Condor City. She claimed to be an outer member of the Sisterhood, and I fell for it. Actually, she wasn't one of them at all. She had only come into contact with people from the Sisterhood before. She said all of this in one breath. Bobo's eyes were filled with confusion. So I don't know where to go next. Do you have any good suggestions? Matthew guessed that Bobo probably didn't have many relatives in this world, so he asked gently, "So is your dream to find that book?" Bobo shook her head, her eyes filled with determination. My dream is to become the world's most powerful arcane machinist. I'll ride a super titan that can cover the sky and the sea and then pour my magic power into the Heavenly Family Palace to see if it will explode. Blow up Heavenly Palace. Matthew's mouth twitched. This idea is very creative. Bobo chuckled. Do you think so, too? A saint once said that the significance of being an arcane machinist was to make the gods tremble. I felt that she was right, so this sentence became my motto. Matthew asked curiously, which saint is it? Bobo's little face turned red, and the orange light on her forehead flickered. I'm not telling you. Matthew chuckled, thinking that if she could really blow up the Heavenly Family Palace, it was not impossible for her to become Saint Bobo. The two of them continued chatting. Bobo was obviously the kind of person who looked cold at first, but after getting familiar with her, she became extremely talkative. She chattered non-stop. Matthew also learned some gossip about the legendary city of Cyber Dragon, which was built on the clouds. But gradually, Matthew's reply was somewhat perfunctory. Bobo didn't notice it at first, but she did eventually. She was a little embarrassed. What's wrong, Matthew? Are you tired? I've been talking too much. Matthew smiled and shook his head. He pointed to the sky and said, It's getting dark. Hint, you have ignited the incense burner of the past, high imitation. Your advancement ritual, the Night of the Undead, has already begun. In the open space, a faint scent of incense overflowed from the small incense burner. Matthew sat on a small stool, and a lot of things were spread out in front of him like a stall. Lucky rabbit feet, cursed monkey claw, bat teeth, boar umbral vein, goat's placenta, water buffalo horn, human's liver stone, small inferior demon's eyeballs. The fuel in the incense burner was a mixture of rhinoceros horn, ghoul liver fat, and a small amount of butter. This ointment could make the living groggy and wake up the undead. Some of the undead could even recover their wisdom and memories for a short period of time. It could attract the nearby undead to join this party that belonged to the undead. Matthew sat there with a mint leaf in his mouth and a small handful of chili in his left hand, ready to use physical methods to keep himself awake at any time. Fortunately, his willpower was high, so the incense burner had little effect on him. Chili shouldn't be of any use. Soon, some of the undead were attracted. The first to come over were the two zombie ladies who were originally trapped in the reeds. Attracted by the incense, they crawled out of the mud pit with difficulty and walked to Matthew's side. Matthew silently put on a boxing glove-like equipment in his right hand. There was also a short stick and a pole on the ground. During the Night of the Undead, he couldn't use any spells or abilities. He could only rely on his eloquence or strength to make friendly contact with the undead. Even though Matthew was extremely charming, he couldn't rule out the possibility that some of the undead would harbor malicious intentions towards him. Boxing gloves, short sticks, and poles were prepared for them. Matthew couldn't hurt them. He could only send them away. This was perhaps the most difficult part of the Night of the Undead ritual. Under Matthew's slightly nervous gaze, Miss Zombie slowly approached. A faint stench assaulted him. Matthew was highly focused. This was the first time he was in such close contact with an undead that he was not controlling. This feeling reminded him of the first time he came into contact with the undead. This was probably how ordinary people felt when they saw the undead. Danger, destruction, loss of control, when these labels were stacked together. It was indeed difficult for people not to panic. The incense slowly rose. Another 2 zombies and a skeleton found their way here. They stood in a row in front of Matthew as if they were all perusing the things on the ground. "Is there anything that you like?" Matthew said calmly. "Everyone can choose one, but only one." The 2 zombie ladies took the lucky rabbit's foot and wild boar's umbilical cord, respectively. The skeleton took the goat's placenta in a daze. One of the remaining 2 zombies grabbed the eyeball of the underling and ran away. The other one suddenly pounced in front of Matthew. His hands grabbed Matthew's shoulders tightly, and his rotten eyeballs almost stuck to Matthew's face. His mouth was full of yellow teeth pus and a pungent smell. All of these made Matthew's hair stand on end. "I want to choose you." "Ha-ha-he." The zombie drooled and was about to kiss Matthew. "Matthew, run. I'll help you blow him up." Beside him, Bobo had already raised the red brick in her hand in a fit of rage. Matthew quickly turned around to stop her. Bobo widened her eyes in disbelief. "Then you'll let him kiss you?" Matthew didn't have time to explain. He turned around and punched the zombie's chin with his right hook. However, the zombie's head was as heavy as lead. Matthew's punch only made the zombie's head tilt a little. Matthew quickly picked up the short stick from the ground and propped it against the zombie's stomach to maintain a certain distance from it. However, the zombie's strength was too great, and Matthew could not hold on much longer. The zombie nudged his hip and knocked Matthew to the ground. "Ha-ha-he. You said it yourself. I can pick anything I like." The zombie threw the short stick aside and pounced over with a strange smile. Seeing this, Matthew hurriedly shouted at the other undead who had taken his things. "This guy is ruining the reputation of the undead. Are you going to watch him do this?" The few undead were stunned for a moment, as if they were thinking about what the reputation of the undead meant. But soon, the 2 zombie ladies who came first grabbed the perverted zombie's neck. The 2 of them worked together to drag the perverted zombie out. Matthew wiped his sweat. Fortunately, the undead were willing to help. Otherwise, he would have to play hide and seek with that perverted zombie for the entire night. Or he'd lose something important. But at this moment, Matthew's heart suddenly skipped a beat. From the corner of his eye, he saw a huge figure slowly walking over from the depths of the swamp. At that moment, Matthew's nerves were extremely tense again. Because it was an abomination. Abominations were powerful and evil undead creatures. The birth of every abomination was filled with pain and anti-human nature. They were terrible, deformed creations, the true reflection of human fear. Each of the abominations had a completely different appearance. The one that appeared in front of Matthew had 7 heads, 6 of which surrounded the largest one in the middle. If one looked from a distance, one might mistake the 6 heads on its neck for necklaces. His limbs were bound by multiple human thighs or calefuls, and there was a bloody mouth on his stomach that was emitting yellow smoke. It was filled with jagged fangs, and a hand would pop out from time to time. Perhaps because it had been in the abomination's abdominal cavity for a long time, that hand had an unhealthy colloid state and looked extremely smooth. The thing that characterized the abominations was the suturing on their bodies. No matter how disgusted he was with this anti-human creation, Matthew had to admit that the necromancer who created this abomination was brilliant. Their tailoring level must be above the master level. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to suture such a perfect wound. Matthew looked around for a long time, but he couldn't find the end of the suture. Other than the mouth on its stomach that was constantly spewing sulfur, there was no pus flowing out of the other parts of its body, nor was there any stench leaking out. This was almost a perfect abomination. other than the dead bodies of Jangos, and Nagas. When he got closer, Matthew noticed that there was a big snake tail behind his butt. It was sewn from the lower body of 3 Nagas, and it looked a little like a braid. This abomination actually had a tail. What kind of heaven-defying aesthetic was this? Matthew could not help but doubt the mental state of the necromancer named Dania. But he quickly dismissed these messy thoughts in his mind. The appearance of abomination was crucial to Matthew. It was both an opportunity and a challenge. First, although the Night of the Undead was the simplest way to advance, there was no requirement for the necromancer and the undead to do anything that night. However, if there were a high-level undead overseeing the ritual, Matthew would have a chance to obtain a large amount of negative energy affinity. His affinity with negative energy had never been high, so he often needed to borrow the power of the negative energy stone. This was an excellent compensation plan. Secondly, if he could get along well with this abomination, he would have a very comfortable night. Bullying the weak and fearing the strong was common among the undead. No one would offend a necromancer who was protected by abomination. Not even that perverted zombie that had just been chased away. So when the abomination comes near, Matthew couldn't wait to get up and welcome him. "Good evening, Mr. Abomination." The abomination did not seem to be fully awake. Facing Matthew's solicitous attention, it only snorted heavily. His gaze drifted to the small objects on the ground. Matthew didn't say anything else. He quickly took out a small demon's head from his magic backpack and offered it with both hands. "Those low-grade goods are not worthy of you. I have specially prepared high-grade goods for a noble lord like you." Abomination's big head had yet to react. The little heads below praised, "This necromancer is a bootlicker. He's afraid that we'll eat him. I like his attitude. If only he bent down a little more when he bowed, I would be able to see his paw." The abomination angrily slapped its little head with its right hand. "Stop it. My head is buzzing." As he spoke, he unceremoniously took the little demon's head from Matthew's hands and stuffed it into his mouth. Crack. 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 The sound of chewing could be heard, and the bloody mouth stopped spewing sulfur. "I also want that." Abomination walked to the side of the stall and poked down with his thick finger. It was unknown which one he was pointing at. "You can take whatever you want." Matthew's face was full of flattery, as if he had become a waiter for the undead. The most interesting thing about the Night of the Undead was that the necromancers, who usually ordered the undead around, were forced to accept the role of the undead on this night. Many necromancers found it hard to let go of their arrogance. They were unable to compromise with their slaves, which eventually led to their failure to advance. Matthew, on the other hand, did not have this burden at all. He was very patient to begin with. When he was really unhappy, he simply imagined that the undeads were all Peggy. In this way, no matter how much suffering he suffered, he would just grit his teeth and endure it. The abomination was picking and choosing from the stalls while the other undead remained motionless. After a while, he picked a lucky rabbit's foot, 2 sections of a gray wolf cecum, and a bat's tooth. "I want all of these," said Abomination gruffly. Matthew nodded and bowed. "Absolutely, Mr. Abomination." The face in the middle looked satisfied. Just as he was about to find a comfortable place to lie down, a small head on his neck suddenly interrupted. "That necromancer said that each person could only take 1 item. It's against the rules if you take more." Abomination looked at Matthew suspiciously. "Is that so?" Matthew nodded. "There is indeed such a rule, but it doesn't apply to you." Abomination said unhappily, "Why?" "I hate preferential treatment." Matthew's face stiffened. Fortunately, he reacted quickly. "This is not preferential treatment. This is because you're not a single entity like the rest of them." Abomination pondered for a moment after hearing that. "You're right." He punched the small head who interrupted him, then strode towards the stall. "I have a lot of people on me, so I have to take a few more." Matthew maintained a smile throughout. These little things were not worth much, so the abomination could take as much as he wanted. Moreover, he was not going overboard. He had only taken half of the things on the stall. Then, he found a comfortable place near the incense burner and sat down, playing with those little things in high spirits. Matthew actually had a lot of stock in his inventory, but he didn't take it out immediately. He just watched quietly. With the abomination holding the line, the other immortals were much more reserved. They were even unwilling to speak. If not for the incense burner, they might have left long ago. Matthew looked on coldly and knew what was going on. A moment later, the cracking sound in the abomination's stomach came to an end. Matthew immediately said gently to the zombie lady, who was in a daze. Can you send this to Mr. Abomination? He took out another head from his luggage. This time, it was an imp's head. It was also the spoils of war from the previous battle. Miss Zombie seemed to be very easy to talk to. She nodded in agreement and hugged the little imp's head as she walked towards the abomination. She didn't say anything and stuffed the imp's head into the abomination's stomach. Catcha catcha. Another round of chewing sound sounded. Abomination looked at her with satisfaction. Oh, thank you. Beautiful lady. Your gentleness reminds me of my late wife. Miss Zombie asked dumbly, wow. What's her name? Abomination sighed deeply. I'm sorry. It's not that I can't remember her name, but I have too many wives. Of course, it's not what you think. In fact, we're all very loyal, but you have to understand that I'm a freak made up of more than 30 humanoid creatures. It's only natural that I have many deceased wives. As for which one, forgive me for being clumsy and not knowing where to start. Miss Zombie exclaimed, wow. So powerful. The abomination chuckled and rubbed its head in embarrassment. Matthew noticed that the other 6 heads were silent at this time. They looked shy and afraid, which was completely different from the scene when they were talking to Matthew. While they were talking, Matthew carefully observed the state of the other undead. They should have been Dania's former subordinates. After Dania left, they lost their master and showed a certain degree of negative energy deficiency symptoms. For example, Miss Zombie. Her skin was extremely dry, unlike the wet skin of a normal zombie. This meant that the negative energy in her body was not enough to sustain water. In the long run, she would become a dried corpse, and her combat strength would be greatly reduced. The others had similar symptoms. Only the abomination was unaffected. This was because he was level 16 and could directly interact with the negative energy plane. In order to make the undead more stable, Matthew took out 6 negative energy stones and placed them next to the incense. This action greatly increased the favorability of the undead present. On the other side, Miss Zombie seemed to have ended her conversation with Mr. Abomination. She returned to Matthew's side in a daze. The night deepened. More and more undead approached. Frightened by the aura of abomination, most of them obediently sat down on the periphery. Matthew saw that the atmosphere was right, so he cleared his throat and said to the undead present. I once heard a story about a headless horseman and a flying ghost that falling in love. Are you interested in hearing it? His words broke the silence of the night of the undead and attracted the attention of all the undead. Miss Zombie was the first to show her support. She looked at Matthew in confusion. The headless horseman doesn't have a head, and the flying ghost head doesn't have a body. Matthew smiled and asked, is this important? Must we be so similar to be together? With that, he gave Miss Zombie another head and let her continue feeding abominations. The undead looked thoughtful. Suddenly, a skeleton stood up. I don't think it's important. We're already dead. If you want to love, then love. Why do you have to follow those rules? Skeleton's point of view won the approval of many undead. However, there were also zombies who objected. This isn't a matter of rules and regulations, but a matter of how to consummate the love. If they can't even do it, then what's the point of their love? Although there weren't many people supporting this zombie, their voices were loud and clear. For a time, both sides were engaged in a verbal battle, and it gradually became lively. Matthew smiled. He had achieved his initial goal. The more the undead quarreled, the happier he would be, as long as they did not fight. Furthermore, with the abomination there, no one would dare to make a move on his territory. As they quarreled, the undead present was divided into 2 groups. One group was the skeleton party, which had the advantage in numbers, the other was the zombie party, which shouted loudly. Both sides insisted on their own words and argued. Like and subscribe.